From the Temple in Independence, Missouri, welcome back to CIMM Sessions, our little bite-sized servings of theology, culture, community of Christ, identity, mission, message, beliefs, and practices. I'm David Lloyd, the director for CIMM, the Center for Innovation for Ministry and Mission through Graceland University and the Community of Christ Seminary. And tonight we're coming to the second part of our series, a two-part series, and hopefully those of you who are watching on video will see part one and watch that first. In this series, we're focusing on crossing generational cultures. A boomer and a millennial walk into a church, and tonight, hopefully you're going to get the punchline. So with that in mind, and from this boomer, I'm going to pass it over to the millennial, and who's with us tonight, and it's Zach Harmon-McLaughlin, who is our seminary dean, and is joining us from the Independence Graceland campus to share with us about generational culture. Zach, it's good to have you with us tonight.
Thank you, David. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm excited to explore a little bit more this evening and continue our conversation. So here is the punchline from where I sit. A boomer and a millennial walk into a church, but it's not the same church, but it's the same church. How's that possible? What does that mean? What do we do with that? So if you were with us last week, and if you weren't, don't worry, you can always watch the recording later on our YouTube channel. If you were with us, you know that David did a great analysis and kind of exposing us to the various layers of the time in which we created meaning out of the world and how that shapes a lens in which we see the world. Now, tonight, I want to caution you. This is going to get a little heady, but it's really important. So I want you to follow me a little bit because where you sit determines what you see. Now, the interesting thing about generational analysis, particularly for a postmodern millennial like myself, is the need to have compartmentalized boundaries of reason, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And I'm going to unpack that in a little while. So tonight, what I want to do is I kind of want to explore the impact of the way in which we make meaning and understanding out of the world, and how that challenges some of the normative assumptions we might bring into community. And I'll give you an example of what I mean really briefly. Each one of us has a basic default when we are not paying attention consciously or paying close attention. And this baseline default is the assumption that everybody else around us is seeing the same thing, thinking the same thing, feeling the same thing, that they're interpreting the words, the images, the experience that we're having in the same space, all the same way, right? It's the baseline assumption that we call normative truth. We're all agreeing to a general reality that we're experiencing together. And on a certain level, that is true. But on another level, it couldn't be further from the truth, right? Because where you sit determines what you see. So if we're in the same, and pardon me, my video may freeze up from time to time. Don't stress about it, but I'll trust David if my audio goes out at some point, he'll jump in and tell me. I'll give you an example of what I mean. If we were all gathered in the Community of Christ temple, and we're all sitting there together, and we are watching a organ and choir recital, are we having the same experience? On one hand, yes, we are, right? We're at the same event. We're listening to the same program. We're experiencing the same thing. However, at the same time of that being true, the opposite is also true. No, we are not having the same experience because you may be sitting in the front row in the very center of the sanctuary. And you're going to pick up on some of the higher and lower tones of the choir because you're close and you might hear those voices, or you might hear the breaths that the choir takes. They might be really audible and you might hear it, and it might be part of this experience. And me, I'm in the far back left of the balcony. I'm as far away from the stage as possible. and how I'm hearing the organ and the choir and the tones that I hear and the experience I have is very different. And so we meet at the end of the concert in the foyer, and you say, "Gosh, that was the most amazing concert I've ever been to. I could hear and feel the breaths that the choir was taking together." And I might say, "No, you're out of your mind. I didn't hear that. I didn't notice that." And yet we were in the same place at the same time, experiencing the same thing without experiencing the same thing. So this is what I want to talk about a little bit tonight. And it's an advancing of this idea of our generational norms and realities. What we're dealing with is a perception problem. I am on one side saying it's a blue square. I love this blue square. This is the best blue square I've ever seen in my whole life. Don't you love the blue square? And you are standing there with me, and you are saying, "No, Zach, I don't know what you're talking about. It is a yellow square, and it's a great yellow square. I think you would really appreciate it if you understood that it's actually yellow, not blue." And we get into this persuasion-driven conflict of, I need to convince you that the data I have is the right data, and the data you have is the wrong data. And if only you understood that you were wrong, you would want to be right, because being right is what? It's good and it's better. Because being wrong is what? It's bad, and you don't want to be wrong. And we've been taught this our entire life, that there is a right and a wrong. And our goal is to be right, to have clarity. So issues like this perception problem exist all the time, every day, in big and in small ways. Sometimes we're able to process through them really quickly together, and other times they are lifelong conflicts that result in different people being marginalized or oppressed, or exclusionary practices, or relationships becoming, broken and unhealed. So we have a perception problem. And the goal is, we are not trapped in quicksand or in mud or in concrete. We can move our feet. I don't have to stay stuck in the balcony of the temple sanctuary. I can walk down and sit next to you. And you're not stuck in the temple sanctuary. You can walk up and join me. We can change our perception. We can shift the way we see. And so we move. And we move toward reconciliation. We move toward peace. We move toward restoration. We move toward healing. We move toward whatever the context of the issue is. And all of a sudden you say, "Oh, oh my gosh, I didn't understand before, but it is a yellow square. I get it. I see it." And I say, "You're absolutely right. I didn't realize where you were sitting and what you could see it. It is a blue square too. It's both of these things. How is that possible?" And if this weren't complicated enough for us, there's more to unpack here, right? Because all of a sudden, there's another voice that says, "I actually think you're both wrong. It's a cube, and it's red, blue, and yellow." There's more to see here, right? And there's additional perspective. There are 100 different analogies and ways we could look at this. But oftentimes in our world, particularly when we begin looking at different contexts of way of seeing and understanding the world, we entrench ourselves out of a desire to not fail, but to be right, and convince ourselves that the way we see the world is the normal and right way to see the world, and that other people who see the world differently than us are either a threat or simply wrong or maybe ignorant. Lately, we've taken the sinful approach of sometimes suggesting that people who think differently than us might be mentally ill. Whatever the caveat or reasoning we give to it, we refuse to see what we can't see. The gift of the moment we all live in, and I don't think it's overstating this to make this point really clear. We are living in a great awakening moment. There is a seismic shift in the way in which we see and understand the world. To give you a really kind of fancy scholarly word, what we call this theological anthropology, the way we understand ourselves and the way we understand God and the connection between the two. And we are literally living in a time that is akin to the Copernican revolution, right? Before Copernicus, we were the center of the universe. And our reasoning and understanding of humanity's value, of our experience, was based on this idea. Then we realize we're a smaller part, not in the center, but on the fringe of this cosmos. And it changes the way we see and understand not only the world, but ourselves. And this moves this perspective of science, of understand the world's not flat, it's a globe. And we begin to reorient the way we see the world. And we are in that moment now. We are shifting from a lens of modernity to a lens of postmodernity, which is causing curiosity and ambiguity and wonder. So David defined modernity and postmodernity for us last week, but I want to give us a more structured definition that I think will highlight why this is so important. Before I do that, I want to reiterate a few things from last week as well. Part of the point here is that you are neither a complete modernist or a complete postmodern thinker. We are all a little bit of both of these. Because of the time and moment we live in a modernity structured world with postmodern ways of understanding in the midst of that structure. So you are neither this or that. Every single one of us on this call tonight are both of these things. And it gets wild and you start to think, wait, I can't be more than one thing. I am this and I am that. But let me explain a little bit. So here is how Donald McKim defines modernity in the Westminster Dictionary of Theological Terms. Here's the definition. Modernity is a term often used to designate the post-Enlightenment period in Europe and North America in which people turn to a scientific culture and its promises in order to fill a void left by the decline in religion. So we're trying to apply reason and purpose to this chaotic life where we're living. The values of the secular culture and rejection of religious authority are primary, as well as a belief in knowledge as certainty, objective, and good. So what's interesting here is you have this post-Enlightenment movement in Western society, Europe and North America, that's rejecting religious norms. If you know your history, you know about the movement, the Reformation movement, American revivalism leads to the Restoration. Several people are wondering and doubting religious authority in terms of just one church or an intermediary for God. And so there's a period of exploration of that. What's interesting is modernity becomes the culture of religion. All we have to do is make religion make sense within order and within clarity to make it objective and good, and it fits into a compartmentalized worldview. The challenge of that then comes with this notion of postmodernity. The other thing I just want to point out, this is largely driven in a Euro-American culture and mindset, right? So you have indigenous or global South cultures at the same time that are not adopting to or seeing the world through this modernity lens. Postmodernity, on the other hand, is a description of a contemporary intellectual and cultural climate, so a way of seeing a climate, as a stage beyond the modernism introduced by the Enlightenment. It is marked by the rejection of objective truth, the rejection, the powers of reason, and the rejection and claims of universality. So essentially, there is no universal truth, there is no objective truth. We are trapped in our own way of seeing the world. Texts and symbols are emphasized together with a corporate understanding of truth that is relative to each community in which one participates. So this may already be a little bit challenging for some of us. You may have heard someone say, "That's not my truth." And your response to that may have been at some point, "That doesn't make sense. You don't have a truth, and I don't have a truth. There is just truth," which at a certain level is true, right? Objective truth is not subjective truth. However, subjective truth is different. You have yours and I have mine. I just explained. We were in the same space, but we had very different experiences. We saw and felt things. So postmodernity gets very complicated when you have an entire group of people who see the world through the rejection of universal truths and the rejection of authority of institutions and power. So this is a basic breakdown of that. Modernity has been the operating paradigm for just shy of 500 years. Within that paradigm, the desired outcome is order, clarity, objective reality. There is no this, five different ways of understanding. It's this or it's that, which makes it compartmentalized and feels good, which also gives us certainty. We know the answer. And if we don't know the answer, we have methods and models that we can find the answer. That's the scientific method, right? I have this hypothesis, I will prove it out, and I will ensure that what I see is not just my feeling or perception, but objective truth. So it's focused largely on the clarity and understanding of truth in the world. Postmodernity, which largely begins to start to emerge in the 20th century, and is still emerging in certain ways, is the essential opposite of that, the rejection of objective truth, meaning I'm not sure there is anything objective beyond what I can experience myself, because I do not know what you're thinking. I do not know what how your brain is processing or the meaning you're making. This makes postmodernity very fluid. It makes it ambiguous. And the irony here of postmodernity is the inability to define it because of its rejection of truth. So postmodern thinkers are really suspect of any definitions that try to clarify what it is, which drives modernists crazy, right? Because modernists need to put it in a box and say, this is what postmodernity is, so we can understand it with certainty and truth. But postmodernity rejects that and takes on a posture of relative truth. And where this particularly begins to challenge some of our religious norms and understandings is through the suspicion of institutional authority. Organizations, i.e. the church, have no authority over my experience. And I will not give the church authority over my experience. And so if there is a boundary or a rule that does not fit within my understanding, I'll just reject the institution that sets the rule. Why this matters is this is what we've seen for the last 30 to 40 years within the landscape of Christianity in the United States. As we continue to explore why different generations are leaving the church at different paces, a big chunk of it is the rejection of institutional authority, the suspicion of that institutional authority, and the fluidity of truth in which we are experiencing it. How can multiple things be true simultaneously? It doesn't make sense. And so we go in search of possibility and what might be. I want to stress here, this is an important piece. While this is largely impacting millennials and Gen Z the most, postmodernity is no respecter of generational boundaries, right? There was recent data put out by Pew that suggests people 65 and over are actually accelerating into the spiritual but not religious or category of nuns, not affiliated with organized religion. As that generation begins to make the shift from modernity structures to postmodernity structures, there is an exodus of curiosity and wonder. And I'm going to unpack that in just a little bit. But if this is sparking questions, just go ahead and drop them in the chat, and David and Bethany are monitoring that, and we'll do some questions a little bit later. So several years ago, there was a great text written by John Dorhauer, who at the time when he wrote it was the president of the United Church of Christ denomination. And it's called Beyond Resistance. I'm sure several of you have probably read it or dabbled with it or have it on the shelf. but it was at the time a pretty revolutionary text in terms of how the church was encountering postmodernity. And I thought this was a great step forward from David's invitation to the way in which we see the world from last week into this uncertain, ill-defined postmodern worldview. So, according to John Dorhauer, there are three primary ways in which the church needs to understand in order to move out of its own way and stop trying to convince various generations or people who have a different perspective that it's a blue square. This is John Dorhauer's approach or attempt to say, maybe it's a cube. Maybe it can be a blue square. There we go. David's got it. Maybe it can be a blue square, a yellow square, and a red square. And in fact, if we take one step back, we might notice it's actually a cube, that those things aren't all that different, that they're a part of one thing. And they share belonging and identity, even in their difference. How is that possible? So there are three things that Dorhauer shares that I think are really important for us this evening. The first is postmoderns do not believe that there is such a thing as universal truth. In other words, what is true for you may or may not be true for me. Now, I already know there are several of us on this call that are like, that is utter crap. I do not know what that means. And it's okay for you to think that. In fact, as a postmodernist, I would say that is the very point. What is true for me is not true for you. And I understand that. I get it. My goal is not to change you or to fix you, but to understand why is that not true for you? To get curious and wonder about the difference in the way in which we understand the world. So he goes on to unpack this first truth of postmodernity for the church by saying this: whether it is a fact or not that there are no universal truths is irrelevant. It's moot because two facts subsist side by side. Postmoderns don't believe in universal truth. And many churches don't know how to teach or preach the ambiguity that permeates a world with no universal truths. So the attempt to try to convince someone of a universal truth is being met by someone who does not recognize the universal truth. So no matter how hard we try to litigate or make someone understand or accept a different way of seeing the world, will consistently be met with uncertainty and wonder, the literal inability to know what you're talking about. Why this matters, moreover, for us as a movement is that our churches weren't built for such ambiguity and curiosity. Our churches are built to teach certainty. Our churches are built to have a fixed doctrine. And I'm going to unpack that in just a few minutes. I want to unpack it right now, and I'm resisting the urge to jump ahead because I want to give you a whole picture. But that's an important piece to pay attention to, right? So if I'm a postmodern thinker or someone who just naturally defaults to that way of understanding the world, and I'm going to a church that is trying to define, compartmentalize, and clarify objective reality that does not align with my lived experience, what is the natural result of that encounter? It's probably me saying, I don't think I fit here. And I'll give you a quick example before I move on to the second truth. The majority of the data suggests people who have left the church and are now either categorized as not affiliated or spiritual but not religious or have found a different faith movement, 78% have left because of a perception of unreconcilable truths within the church. What does that mean? It means this. I go to a church that says all are welcome, but there is a secret and silent comma but where we don't accept the ministry of women. How are all people welcome and all people called, but we exclude certain people from certain things? So that certainty of truth is met with a relative experience that does not align with that truth. And now we have to find a different way to reconcile that. The second truth that Dorhauer points out is that postmoderns learn differently. The way in which postmodern thinkers or default thinkers understand and make sense out of the world is not the same as it was 100 years ago or 180 years ago, or 300 years ago. He unpacks it by saying this: this is not a rejection of church as church. So this is not a faith crisis. This isn't a wonder of, do I have a relationship with God or Jesus? In fact, at one point, now this is data from 2016, so it very well could be different at this point. But at that point, the data was suggesting that something like 95, 96% of people who have left organized religion still had an active spiritual or faith life. So it's not a rejection of church as church. This is not a denial of the value of a life well lived, of a life of faith and meaning encounters with the and shaped by like-minded people living in a committed community of faith with one another. It is simply the experience of coming to church, wanting to have a meaningful encounter and walking out understimulated, bored, and having learned little to nothing. This single epistemological shift is a direct result of sitting children in front of the television, the computer, the notebook, the smartphone, which is a game changer. Schools are adapting to this way of learning, but by and large, churches are not. So if we are experiencing the world in different ways now, in order to create meaning and connection and belonging, but the church is still processing or participating in an old model, we run into challenging encounters to that. Now, I want to stress here, Dorhauer is not advocating for brighter lights, better praise music, bigger projectors. That's not what he's suggesting. What he's suggesting is that how we learn and understand is different than the model we are encountering. And then finally, the third truth that Dorhauer unpacks in his text is that postmoderns do not trust institutional authority. And this becomes highly problematic for a complex member organization. How do we control the behavior or the shared value, ethical ecosystem that we share as community? This is a different CIMM session for a different time, but I think the concept of membership in a postmodern world is highly problematic. By very definition, the perspective of membership is that you're either with us or not. It is a framework of difference that segregates who belongs and who doesn't. And in a postmodern world, this provides all kinds of problematic issues. At the same time, I could argue without membership, there are all kinds of problematic issues, right? So I'm not suggesting one's better or worse. I'm just putting this out there for us to get curious. Dorhauer unpacks this comment by saying this: these characteristics, or well, actually, he's unpacking all three of them here in this quote. I misspoke there. These characteristics of the postmodern world contribute greatly to the decline of the church of modernity. Skepticism about universal truth, a different way of learning, and a built-in mistrust of authority. They are not really on the table for debate. Postmoderns are not interested in arguing with a modern world about who is right and who is wrong. Remember, truth is relative. A postmodern is going to have the default of, I understand why you think differently than I do. That's okay. There's not a need for certainty explicitly. They just happen to live in a world where expectations, assumptions, and perceptions have changed. They also happen to experience the church of the modern world as incapable of making the kind of changes necessary to meet their vastly different spiritual hungers. So what we have here in this clash of generational and modernity or postmodernity thinking is this: a church that is convinced that the church is a blue square, and a dynamic faith community that is convinced it is a yellow square, and a God calling a prophetic people to get out of their own way and see that it's a cube, that there is something deeper and broader and bigger in front of us. When I was doing some of my doctoral research, this came out in this kind of a way, which I think is a way to kind of give an example or highlight the difference between modernity and postmodernity. When I asked participants in my research study, what do you think about when you think about church? 70% of participants, when thinking about church, those are the words I used, reported on a building or Sunday morning or a bulletin. It was the tangible pieces of church. When I changed the question directly after asking that to how do you experience church? Only 4% of participants mentioned a building, Sunday morning, or a bulletin. 96% of the research participants talked about relationship and community. When I asked, how do you experience the church? They began to tell me stories about the people they loved. I experience the church when David shows up and tells me stories about his week, and we talk about his family or his kids. I experience church when my best friend and I get together before the service begins, and we eat donuts together or drink coffee, whatever it is, right? They begin to recount the encounter of community. And I think this is a great representation of the difference between modernity and postmodernity to a point, and the difference between being and doing. So here we're confronted with the linear progression of modernity, which yearns for the progressive path ahead. It's a very linear process, right? It's the scientific method. A plus B equals C. That makes sense. That's objective truth. I can wrap my head around it. There's not a lot of variable in there. But in the meantime, we have a postmodernity that's craving a deepening of what is moving into the unknown, seeking wisdom to clarify and move us further along, but pulling us deeper into relationship, where multiple things are true simultaneously, and we're discovering meaning and connection from various ways. Diana Butler Bass, in her text, Christianity After Religion, gives a great analogous example of what we're talking about here tonight. And it's the difference between language that modernists might use and postmodernists might use. So the traditional language of religion would be, this is the institution, this is how it's organized, here's our dogma, our rules, here's how we're ordered and structured. The pastor has authority. Past them is the mission center president. Then we have the Council of 12, and here's how power makes sense. We have these buildings, and within those buildings, these different practices happen, and here's what that looks like. And for years, growing up in the church, we've talked about the hierarchy of a priesthood and how that's not necessarily a good thing. A postmodern approach to that language is to simply give additional meaning to it. Instead of institution, it's an experience. Instead of an organization, it's the community of belonging I'm connected to. Instead of rules, it's transformation or transcendence. Instead of order, it's curiosity and wonder. Instead of dogma, it's intuition or prophetic participation. Instead of authority of the institution or the structure, we give authority to God, and we try to figure out where the sacred is active in our lives. Instead of beliefs, we choose the pilgrimage of meditation. Buildings, we find God in the sacredness of creation, and so on and so forth, right? Again, I'm not giving right or wrong conditions to either list here. What I'm trying to highlight is the different way of seeing and understanding the same thing. So I want to go just a little bit further in that. Primarily, a modernist approach to organized religion sees the importance of doctrine. Doctrine being a set of beliefs that are held and taught, and beliefs aren't the last word, but an invitation for exploring, but they outline in a pretty clear way and consistent way what we believe on a variety of things. However, in the early 21st century, Community of Christ comes up with these things called the enduring principles, which articulate the heart, essence, and soul of our community. The interesting thing about principles are they are a fundamental truth that serves for a foundation for a system. In other words, saying there is no linear path toward them, but a complex matrix path of experience to encounter or experience them. In some ways, this reminds me of the Luke 5 story of the disciples on the boat fishing, casting their net into the deep. Beyond just the shift from doctrine to principle, we're also encountering the shift from belief to ambiguity. Belief in modernity is a necessary reality of accepting truth with a sense of certainty. Here's how I know what I know. So we call this knowing. Ambiguity, on the other hand, is the quality of being open to more than one interpretation, the literal act of not knowing. I don't know exactly what I believe. Now, here's what I want to stress. We need all of it. We need doctrine and principle. We need belief and ambiguity. They are not mutually exclusive. They play an important role in the life of one another. And Jesus knows this. I just want to highlight how Jesus approaches this. Jesus participates in ambiguity and curiosity more than certainty throughout the Gospels. He asks over 183 questions. Depending on which scholar you are reading, he only answers 3 to 8 of them. So before Jesus picks certainty, Jesus defaults to curiosity and inquiry and wonder. When asked a question, more often than not, Jesus does not respond with an answer, but responds with a question. Responds by getting curious and wondering. Jesus is demonstrating this shift in the gospel of probing us deeper into a matrix way of thinking and understanding. A few more things, and I'll wrap it up for us in a way that hopefully makes sense. So we are in the middle of a moment of this great reversal of understanding what it means to be a connected faith community called a church. And for about 20 years, we've been wrestling with trying to figure out what's next for the church. Many generations are approaching that question from the mindset of a modernist. There is certainty out there. We just have to find it. So we can engage in the scientific method to figure out reasoning. And if we know why people left, we can fix that and they can come back. We can find an answer. While postmodernists are out there saying there may not be an answer. We may have to reimagine what it means to be together. Diana Butler-Bass highlights this best, I think, in her text, Christianity After Religion, where she articulates the great reversal that we're in the midst of and the tension between modernity and postmodernity. She says, for the last few centuries, Western Christianity has ordered faith in a particular way. Catholics and Protestants taught that belief came first, then behavior, and finally belonging resulted, depending on how you answered the first 2 questions. So if you believe like us and you behave like us, we'll let you stay. If you don't believe like us and you don't behave like us, you don't belong here. You need to go somewhere else. Churches turned this pattern into rituals of catechism, character formation, and confirmation. We turned it into traditionalism. At birth, Christian children were either baptized or dedicated, with sponsors and parents answering belief questions on their behalf, promising to teach them the faith. As children grew, Sunday schools and catechism classes taught Christian doctrine and the Bible, ensuring that each generation knew the intellectual content of the tradition. Eventually, children moved from Sunday school classrooms to big church, where they participated in grown-up church practices and learned how to pray, worship, sing, give alms, and act kindly. When a Christian child reached the age of intellectual and moral accountability, for us in Community of Christ, it's 8, the church would offer the right of full membership in the form of communion, confirmation, or, in the case of Baptists, adult believer baptism. Believe, behave, belong. It is almost second nature for Western people to read the religious script in this way. But what we are encountering is a shift toward belonging first, understanding what that means, then how to be in community or behave in community, and how the beliefs are connected to that way of being in community. So I want to end us, and we'll go into some Q&A here at this point, with 2 final quotes to wrap this all together. Primarily, the invitation of understanding our different generations and our different ways of seeing the world is an invitation to change our perspective, to move away from our concepts of right or wrong, the need for certainty or ambiguity, but a willingness, and I would say a requirement of being a prophetic people, is a willingness to not know what we don't know. You only become a prophet if you're willing to not know and allow yourself to listen to God to discover knowing. And in most cases, if you read the prophets, they have to do this like several times. So Landon and Smith, in their great book from 1969, For What Purpose Assembled, say this as an invitation to us today. The witness and promise of the Christian faith makes it possible for the church, her congregations, and her members to face the threats, the demands, and the awesome possibilities thrust before her in these days. We need not shrink into the bland conformism of the status quo, be it modernity or postmodernity, nor should we fear the possibility of failure and disappointment. This is my favorite part. The church is not called to be successful. It is called to be faithful, even willing to risk all, even to die in response to God's love in Jesus Christ and our calling to ministry and mission. Like the early brethren who bore the name Christian in their hearts, so too should we be accused of turning the world upside down in our efforts to respond to the working of God in our day. And the closing invitation then of this chaotic way of seeing the world is from John Pavlovitz in his book, A Bigger Table. I'm hoping this page won't be the end for you. I'm hoping it will begin another chapter in your story. I'm hoping this is a launching pad and not a landing pad. I want to encourage you to keep looking at the crowds with those eyes of compassion through the lens of love and not fear. Show up in the middle of the noise and the mess out there and bring something redemptive. Ask anything and say everything because you can. The only way the table around us is ever truly going to be big enough is if we all make more room within us. God has always worked this way. The kingdom has always started within. Love has always been an inside job. Grab some wood and grab some tools. We have work to do. Whew, there's so much left unsaid, but that is where we will end it this evening. With a brief attempt to see the world from several different vantage points.
Goodness, so much to say, so many questions also to get through from our chat here. So hopefully we'll have our answers short and can get through as many as possible. But thank you so much, Zach. Good yin to the yang of last week's presentation. So help us move into the concept now that we know what the modernist point of view would be, and now we know the problem, we can take care of it, right? That would be the modernist response. So I'm going to try to get around that and start talking about the ambiguity here. But Ron asked a question first. In postmodernity, is there a reality that exists outside and independent from the corporate community understanding of truth?
Yes, but it's not straightforward. So there are layers or levels to truth. And this is actually something we spend a lot of time unpacking in graduate school, which we don't have time for tonight. But yes, objective truth exists, and postmoderns know this, right? Objective truth would be some of the physical laws of our existence. The most basic way to describe it is there are periods of light and dark, and they seem to follow a pattern of, 24 hours each. Right?
And shades of gray. Yeah.
Right. So the objective truth. However, where it gets funky is how we define that and what we call that then has the layer of culture and societal norms that agree, right? So if you speak English and you're in North America, there's a way to talk about it where everybody kind of understands that you're talking about the daylight and nighttime. But if you live in the Arctic Circle, big parts of the year, you're like, we don't have that. It's only light. It's only daytime for months. So that already creates a different normative, cultural, societal basis. But then right under that, then you have the individual subjective truth. And that tends to be where we actually operate from. Even though we know it's not universal, we apply our subjective truth on the world around us. And that's why things get so complicated.
Kelly asks, is there some list somewhere that has where modernity and postmodernity have shared beliefs, where there might be a Venn diagram maybe of the overlap between the two?
There isn't one. I do think this text by John Dorhauer, Beyond Resistance, is a very decent basic starting place. But this is just the reality of what we're talking about here. There are scholars who have spent their entire career trying to figure the difference between these two things out. And it doesn't go well typically, right? Because our experience, our human condition is so dynamic that it's challenging. So I don't know of an easy or simple overlap.
Yeah, I would take a look at it from the aspect of not being so much of an overlap. It's just all of us are not all postmodern or modernist. It's like you said, we have these little strands that are connecting us to both sides and some kind of crossover, and it's shaped on the strands of value and beliefs and the way we act and the way that we interpret, and all the time we're cutting off fibers, like the one true church doesn't work for me anymore. So I'm clipping that one, and oh, the Christian community works for me over here, and we're connecting this one. And so at times we're seeing that we're in the midst of both of them. And as generations move through, you can see the fibers changing. And we're in that place where we're going through an era change. Not just a generational change, but a whole era change, and it's hard, and many of the people go through this, and it's dramatic, it's shifting, it's chaotic, and yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say. I think that's a great point, right? And true to postmodernity, it's both and. And I'll give you an example. I I've spent the last 10 years of my career exploring ambiguity and curiosity and wonder, not knowing. But there are a lot of things that I'm certain about, right? I hold beliefs. I have beliefs. I have things that I am pretty clear are certain truths, right? Especially when it comes to the safety of children or basic moral frameworks of, you know, like we can even go old school Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill. I think killing in general is a bad thing, right? So I have some certainty and clarity of belief. At the same time, I live the majority of my life in the tension of not knowing what I don't know. And I am comfortable knowing that my beliefs aren't fixed. The things I'm certain about may change. For example, when I was 8, how I understood God and how I knew God was pretty fixed for me. I was convicted in it. I was one of those kids that was excited to get baptized because I knew what it was and I wanted to do it. If 8-year-old Zach met 40-year-old Zach, it'd be a very different conversation, right?
Yeah,
Because my
yeah.
beliefs changed and shifted. So I am both of these things simultaneously, and it is complex. It's a pair.
and and there are emerging generations who will challenge you in regard to that, right?
Absolutely.
And that's part of the whole idea about generational understanding, is that we are each here to challenge each other, not confront, but to challenge each other's thinking on that. I love the cube design and thought there that you had. Ron said Karl Popper, respected philosopher of science in the 20th century, said, proved, quote unquote, truth could not be proven. One can
Ah,
only prove that something was untrue or incorrect.
wild, wild. Yeah,
Uh,
so there is a theory that our brain can't handle a negative. So
you can't handle the truth.
if I give you a negative command, you will instantly do it, right? So if I say don't think of an elephant,
Yeah.
you just thought of an elephant, even though I said don't think of an elephant. And the more I say it, the more you actually think the inverse of a negative. Um, so this is actually really a fascinating existential kind of question of wonder that we don't have time to explore tonight, but Ron
Yeah.
is onto something deep there.
Yeah. So Kathy asks, has a seminary or have you explored words that might work better in our invitations? Intentionality and copywriting using research that was presented in these sim sessions.
Yeah, there have been a handful of us that have tried to do some of that work. None of it has become corporate or denominationally, like ordained or blessed. But I'll give you a quick just example. Using the mission prayer as kind of a framework to bridge this liminal space and gap we find ourselves in. And how I have broken that down with a handful of other colleagues is using the terms awaken, risk, and bless from that mission prayer framework as a model to do some of the things we talked about tonight. So the mission prayer, by its very like structure, invites us not into certainty, but into wonder, right? The function of the prayer is to get us out of our own way, my own agenda, my own bias. Everybody knows the world would just be better if everybody thought like me and did what I wanted them to do. But the mission prayer says, Zach, get out of your own way. Pay attention to where God is at work ahead of you today and participate with God when you notice God so that you can become a blessing. And so that framework is actually a great way to shift perception. If I'm stuck seeing a blue square, the mission prayer is a framework of awakening to what is actually happening around me, where God is actually at work, risking allowing myself to get unstuck from seeing a blue square and move to a different spot to maybe see something else, and then blessing to go back to the people who were standing with me at the blue square and say, there's a whole different world out here. There's a yellow square around the corner.
And that might actually be the framework in which we are best able to share with people what is the move from modernity to postmodernity in the church. In the past, it has been, we're going to tell you the truth from behind the pulpit. You're going to hear the truth and you're going to do the truth. And in the rising church, it is asking the question and hearing a different perspective long enough to ponder on it and see where that works in your life. And so I think one of the main things in postmodernity is actually listening to people with different perspectives.
Yeah.
Which means that you might have to change. And this is one of the things we don't like the most. And we don't go to church to change. We go to church to, be the same thing that we were, forever. No, the whole idea about the concepts of change and growth
Yeah.
are part of what this bubbling up is.
Well, can I just add something real quick to that theologically?
Yeah.
Because I think it's important for all of us. And this is why I shared that slide about Jesus asking questions versus answering. My assumption, I'm going to make a big assumption and generalization for us here. So I know it's not universally true because I'm a postmodern thinker. Is that we all, if you read the gospel, I think all of us would give the credit to Jesus, that Jesus understood a deep and everlasting truth that is transcendent and transformational. Jesus has clarity of that. Yet, if that is true, why does Jesus never say it? Why does Jesus always respond to these probing doubts and attacks on ministry, miracles, character with curiosity and question? Wouldn't it be easier for Jesus to just say, well, here's the truth. Now you have it. You're welcome. But that's not Jesus' approach. And I think there's something very important for us to theologically pay attention to there as we go through our own discipleship journey, particularly as a prophetic people. So to that point, that's why I added that, because Jesus models this in a way where Jesus has conviction and beliefs and certainty and clarity. And at the same time, over and over again, chooses the path of curiosity and discernment. He retreats in prayer consistently to listen to God. So an affirmation of, I don't know what I don't know. This requires me paying attention to the will of God. So I'm going to go listen for the will of God, not just follow my own agenda, my own ego, my own bias. Anyway, I think it's an important theological point.
Absolutely. So Blake West asks, for many, it is enticing to have a church that has the answer, and you need to join it to find the path to salvation. Let's see. Us versus them arguments between churches, while some seek certainty. How do we grow as a church with an acceptance of ambiguity?
Yeah. Gosh, so those are really good questions. And I would just say, I don't have an answer. Two, we are living in the trauma and woundedness of that experience, right? We have 120 years of the narrative being, we have the truth and no one else does. So we've got to share that with them, because we're right and essentially everybody else is wrong. When that began to become deconstructed for us as a movement, we've had a really hard time figuring out, what does it mean to be a church that still has truth, but not the only truth? And how then do we share that? And I think we've had a hard time reconciling that tension. Now, we've taken great strides. We've done some amazing things. We are clarifying our identity, particularly the movement toward being a community of Christ, right? We could go back 40 years and name a lot of those theological pieces, but we are we are a great example of the confrontation of the tension we're talking about. A movement that goes from we have the truth, we're going to fix everything, to we're part of this bigger story that is complicated and we're not totally sure where we fit in it, but we know we do fit in it and we're unique and special and we have a part to play, but it's just a part. And somehow God's love and grace transcend all of that. So it gets really fascinating. And I actually think we need to do some theological work on that, on the confrontation we've experienced in our own theological journey as we've deconstructed that narrative to try to figure out now what does truth mean for Community of Christ.
Yeah, and I think practical application I'm going through all these questions. We're not going to get through all of them, but Donnie says, "Thank you for helping to understand this new generation. I'm going to be helping teach a baptismal class," and that just all the bells and whistles go off because we were talking about membership and how even the concept of membership is on especially three of our sacraments, on baptism, confirmation especially, and even the Lord's Supper. Even though the Lord's Supper it's waned a lot into inclusivity, and yet we still are talking about membership. And when we teach the elder and teachers class, we talk about how confirmation is something so much more than membership, because if it was about membership, we'd all be praying to the holy Shelby system, and none of us want to do that because we don't like it anyway. So to recognize that membership is a part, and maybe it needs to continue to take a lower and lower part, but there are things happening there of inclusion and the recognition of something that we don't always take the time to recognize, and that the sacraments are these little signposts along the road, not the place we arrive to. And we can already see the postmodern approach beginning to shape our World Conference action as we talk about membership issues. And I'm sure soon we're going to be talking about priesthood authority and how that operates in a postmodern world, and all of the legislation that we make that is held within the framework of a church that's talking about faithful disagreement, and we can see it happening. So yeah, any comments on that?
Too many comments on that.
Yeah.
I actually would like, so part of me wants to be like academic and engage a little bit and say we actually only have one sacrament that requires membership. The rest are all invitational. And the only sacrament that requires membership is ordination, right? Baptism is free for all, regardless. And confirmation is actually confirmation of the Holy Spirit first, and then membership secondly. So you actually aren't a member for confirmation. The result of the sacrament is membership, but not
Yes.
the
And
invitation.
yet we focus on membership so much. Yes.
Right. And I already think we're facing questions of authority of priesthood. And we're already facing questions of authority of the institution, and how far that reach and threshold goes. And this is a conversation that it's not going to emerge. It's happening. And a primarily easy place to do this, to the point of generational learning, is to go talk to people who are 20 and 15, and ask questions about how they see the role of authority or belonging. And don't just take their first answer. Get them to go deeper. Primarily, they are already intrinsically seeing the world differently. But any generation can do this. But they're going to challenge parts of the church authority, right? They're going to challenge parts of the church structure and the idea of membership. When Jesus's Great Commission is to all people, not just to this church or that church, they're fascinating, important theological questions that this is what I'll say to wrap it up, because I'll talk too long about it. So this is what I'll say. I think we need to abandon our preoccupation with trying to find the answer.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of the words in 161, fix your eyes to the place beyond the horizon to which you are sent. The point of a prophetic journey is that you do not know the destination. Yet, I think most of us subconsciously interpret this invitation by saying, oh, we just have to go to the horizon because something happens at the horizon where once we get to the horizon, we'll have all the answers. We'll see the promised land. And so we'll know what it looks like. We'll be able to wrap our mind around it and finish the journey. When in reality, the consistent invitation of the prophet is you do not get to know where you are going. And indeed, you may never get there because it is beyond what you can see. So we need to abandon the preoccupation with the perspective that we think we can actually know and begin to become vulnerable and courageous with the vulnerability that we define God as mystery. The starting place for all of this is not a technical fix, but the adaptive reality of a prophetic people who do not know what they do not know. And that's radical.
Yes, yes, and that's prophetic, and that's the future. Um, wow, I can already tell there are a bunch of other questions in the queue, and we have run out of time tonight. And I even had a list of other questions. I think in the future, Zach, we're going to need to do a follow-up on this. There's a lot of other good stuff here that it's really good when we can take the time and disseminate what is happening in our own culture that is bringing about this change, and how do we understand it, and how do we listen to it, to help us and to help those within our community to continue to grow. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Zach. It's good to have you here with us.
Always.